One of the awesome things about watching something for the first time and not watching it until years later is that you can go back and rewatch the episodes to remember which characters were most interesting and which arcs are most interesting. And in today's video, we are going to talk about Jiren. Now, to be specific, I have to give you guys a lot of credit here. Many years ago, when we were talking about Dragon Ball Super episode to episode, you guys basically predicted with perfect accuracy that Jiren was going to be a totally forgettable character. Now, the arc itself is not forgettable, and the transformations that both Goku and Vegeta attained are definitely memorable. But Jiren himself is essentially just a placeholder character that was just designed to bring out the best in Goku. And we will talk about this more in depth, but we actually have to start off by directly talking about why Jiren is so forgettable, and one of the easiest ways to point this out is that there's just nothing really that interesting about him as an actual character. Now, design-wise, Jiren is obviously designed like what we depict as a gray alien, even though Frieza also is somewhat designed like a gray alien if you look at his fourth form specifically, or his main form if you want to go with that. But specifically with the way that Jiren's eyes are designed, and also specifically with his skin color and the way he carries himself, he's obviously designed in that way. And obviously with his huge muscular physique, he obviously has that whole old school throwback Dragon Ball alpha male physique that, you know, a lot of Dragon Ball fans originally watched when they saw Dragon Ball Z. So, at least from a design point of view, he does feel like more of a throwback old school Dragon Ball character. But in terms of actual fighting abilities and techniques, there's really not that much that we could say about Jiren that's truly cool. Now, the interesting thing about Jiren is that if you directly switch him with the character of Toppo, the interesting thing there is that you can make a serious argument that Toppo would have made a better final boss villain in the actual Tournament of Power, because if you look at Toppo specifically, because he was a god of destruction and training and uses destructive energy, that would have been a very, very interesting character to have as the final boss, especially because as a god of destruction and training, you could always use his character in a future way that can actually tie directly into the storyline of how we find out more about how gods of destruction actually work, as he's really a unique character in that particular sense. But when we go back to Jiren specifically, the thing about him is that we don't know anything about his character either. And usually in Dragon Ball, there's enough of a background that we see on a character that makes us care somewhat, and the only thing that we ever really got out of Jiren is the tragedies that he went through in his youth that essentially forced him into being emotionless and having such a stoic attitude. And there were moments throughout the Tournament of Power where Jiren essentially felt like a villain, but you could just never buy it because he's a member of the Pride Troopers, which is a heroic organization. So as a result of that, you're always just looking at this hero villain, but then the show's trying to make him look like a bad guy when in fact he's not bad at all, you know, and that was always the interesting thing there too. Now, the other thing about Jiren is that even if you look at the manga adaptation, which came after the anime, which is usually obviously a shock because in most cases the manga comes first, Jiren wasn't even really that interesting in the manga either. And I don't want to bash why, because let's just be honest, the way that Dragon Ball Super designed the Tournament of Power in terms of its story structure, I mean, it's kind of hard to really go in depth on the characters, because the way that the story is designed is that these characters are all just members of different universes coming together to fight for their own respective universe. And as a result of that, and because there's so many different characters and the level of pacing has to be insanely fast, you don't really have a lot of time to go into the actual characters themselves. And that actually makes a lot of perfect sense, which is why having such a bland character for Jiren was essentially perfect for this arc, because what he does as an individual doesn't really matter, since he doesn't really have any unique abilities, as he just punches and kicks and fires energy blasts just like any other character did from Dragon Ball Z+. Whereas if you look at a character like Toppo, at least there was something cool there. And when we compare Jiren with his other Tournament of Power counterparts in Caulifla Kale and then eventually Kefla, I would feel that at least in the Tournament of Power, they definitely got the best shine, where we learned enough about their relationship and, you know, what they are as characters to at least make them more memorable in their own respective sets. Now, Kale is probably the most memorable character from the Tournament of Power, especially because, I mean, let's just be honest, she's basically Broly with lipstick, and that's by nature making her the most unique, but also because she's a prodigy in her own right that is not fully confident in her own abilities in a very Gohan-like way. And then you have a character like Caulifla that may not have the latent potential that Kale does, but she learns things extremely fast, and is the polar opposite type of character when you look at how brash and how confident she is in herself and her desire to keep fighting and getting stronger. And seeing the merge of two totally different characters into this powerful entity, which eventually became Kefla, was a very unique thing. And even though Kefla has basically Caulifla's entire personality with Kale's power boost, it was interesting to see all of the build-up that eventually led to that actual fusion itself. You know, so obviously because of pacing and for all of these different reasons, there were other characters that, you know, got some shine too. And even Annie Raza, you know, when we look at how he's basically just a remade Hachiak, was an interesting character too, to see kind of like that whole, you know, plan to eradicate the Saiyans throwback feel that we saw in the Tournament of Power. And, you know, one thing that I have to give Dragon Ball credit for, and one of the good things about Jiren, is that Dragon Ball has always been effective at introducing new characters and making sure that that new character just seems cooler or more superior to the other relative characters. And if we give an old school example, it would have to be Android 16, 17, and 18. And the way that the show wrote very, very quietly that 18 was the weakest, 17 was in the middle, and 16 was the strongest, where 18 went out first, and they showed mystery in 17's ability, where he basically just knocked Trunks down so easily with one blow, when in fact 18 was having an easy time with Vegeta, but she had to put in more effort to actually defeat him, and then eventually 16 was always just sitting back quietly, and we didn't know much about him until he eventually had to fight against Imperfect Cell. And the way that it showed the mystery of its characters was perfect in how it correlated to the character of Jiren, and how, you know, all of the other Pride Troopers were doing their own thing in the tournament, and Jiren was just kind of sitting there often meditating because the other characters were such peons to him that he didn't even have to waste his time or his energy. And that was a very unique and interesting way to build up a character, even if he didn't have any unique abilities on his own. And ultimately, when we look at the character of Jiren, we can make two ultimate conclusions in a positive way. One of them is that he essentially was just a placeholder character that was there to bring out Goku's abilities. When you look at the Tournament of Power, it was all about just passing your limits, and it didn't really matter what Jiren was. He just needed to be a strong character that was generic to push Goku into really unlocking his forms, because when you go back to the entire arc itself, you realize it was literally all about Goku just breaking into his limits, and also having some side characters do some cool things too. And in the future, I mean, if we were to ever think of a way to utilize Jiren's character and get creative, let's be objective here. The only way that we could really see Jiren being used would be if there was some type of arc where there was a villain in Universe 11 that was just so powerful that Jiren and the Pride Troopers had to basically ask Goku and our characters for help in Universe 7, or any other character to come over into their universe and help them defeat this huge, powerful monster that they can't stop themselves. And considering the fact that, you know, now we have even stronger characters that have existed in the Dragon Ball universe, like Broly and Moro, and all of these new characters that have been coming out, Jiren is just slowly being pushed aside in a very similar fashion to Hit, where he was a very unique character in the Universe 6 tournament, but now, because of Jiren and the characters that came after, he's a totally forgettable character. And ultimately, when we break everything down, the other thing that we could also find out about Universe 11 is more of an explanation as to what the Pride Troopers' life actually is. And Dragon Ball Super did a decent job of giving us a taste for what the Pride Troopers usually have to go through, but it would also directly explain why the Pride Troopers are so ridiculously strong, because they live in a universe that has extremely powerful villains all the time. So powerful that they require such a strong force to constantly fight against them. And had it not been for the Pride Troopers, the universe would have been in total chaos, and Universe 11 would have had probably the lowest mortal ranking considering how powerful their villains actually are. In a very One Punch Man-like way where huge villains are always just showing up and you always have to constantly fight them. So as a result of all of that, I feel like Universe 11 is probably the most unique universe in the Dragon Ball world, considering the fact that the entire universe is an intergalactic organization fighting against these entities, whereas in Universe 7 it's mostly just Earth-based. And even though our characters have gone through a lot of battles and training and all of these different things to get to their particular level of battle, the fact that Universe 7 is so fixated on Earth and Earth's heroes just makes it feel a lot more limited in nature, whereas Universe 11 feels more connected. So ultimately, that's the only logical way that it would ever make sense to indoctrinate Universe 11 and Jiren into the Dragon Ball story.